to our webinar today with the Sentencing Project. My name is Jean Chung, and I'll be facilitating. I'm the Communications Manager at the Sentencing Project. Our presenter today is Nazgol Ghandnoosh, who's a research analyst at the Sentencing Project, who conducts and synthesizes research on criminal justice policy. Her work focuses on racial disparities in incarceration, trends in public opinion about punishment, and sentencing policies. And when she is not working, you can find her on camping or hiking trips with her adorable 2-year-old daughter, Asha. Today's webinar is on Nazgol's recent report, Race and Punishment, Racial Perceptions of Crime and Support for Punitive Policies, which was featured in the New York Times and the New Yorker and many other publications. The report examines how racial perceptions of crime are a key cause of the severity of punishment in the United States and shows that the consequences of white Americans' strong associations of crime with blacks and Latinos extend far beyond policing. Nazgol will go over the major findings of the report and talk about some recommendations for the media, policymakers, and criminal justice professionals to reduce racial perceptions of crime and mitigate their effects on the justice system. The slides of the webinar, as well as the recording, will be available online afterwards. And we will have a Q&A session after the presentation. You can either call in your questions after the presentation, or you can submit them electronically. You can submit them throughout the presentation, but we recommend writing down your questions as you think of them and submitting them at the end, because often questions that you have earlier in the presentation might be answered later on. So with that, I'll give it to Nazgol.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you all for joining today. I'm Nazgol Ghandnoosh, and I wrote this report with the help of my colleagues at the Sentencing Project. I started the research for this project long before the events in Ferguson, but since the topic is racial perceptions of crime, other well-known shootings of innocent people of color were very much on my mind, including Oscar Grant and Trayvon Martin. And then Ferguson happened, and it all started with Michael Brown, a young, unarmed African-American man being fatally shot by an officer. And we saw some very familiar, but also some new developments after that. So what was familiar about it was the suspicious circumstances under which Brown was shot, and the possibility that race played a large part in the assessment of threat with which Officer Darren Wilson approached that confrontation. Another familiar outcome from what the developments in Ferguson was the reaction, the racial gap in the reactions to Ferguson. So polls showed afterwards that the majority of blacks stated that the incident raised important racial issues, but only a minority of white Americans said that they thought that race was relevant to this shooting. What was new from Ferguson was the calls from the community, but also more broadly around the country for reforms. And so I want to pick up here and delve a little bit more deeply into these issues. And what I'm going to show you and talk about is how racial perceptions of crime impact the entire criminal justice system, not just policing. And they have consequences for everybody, not just people of color. And I'm going to conclude by talking about a number of interventions that have been put into place around the country to challenge racial perceptions of crime and to mitigate their impact on the justice system. Here's my argument. So I'm going to be making the following argument, that racial perceptions of crime among whites, who comprise the majority of policymakers, criminal justice practitioners, the media, and the general public, have bolstered harsh and biased crime control policies. So let me say a little bit more about some parts of this. So I say racial perceptions of crime, and I'm specifically referring to the associations that people have of crime with African Americans and Latinos. And so I'm going to be using the terms African American and Black interchangeably and Latino and Hispanic interchangeably. And I'm specifically focused on these two populations because they're the largest populations affected by criminal justice policies, and they're the populations on which there's the most research that has been done. Second, I'm focused on whites and whites' racial perceptions and the implications, because a lot of research has shown that whites are more likely than others, than people of color, to have these racial associations of crime. And when they have these racial associations of crime, it's more likely to lead them to be more punitive than when they don't have these associations. And so before I proceed, I just want to say that my goal here is not to vilify any particular population, any particular group, but instead it's to diagnose a problem so that we can identify remedies. So I'll be talking a lot about support for punitive policies and punitive sentiment. And so just to give you an overview of what I mean here, here's some data that was pulled together by Mark Ramirez, a professor, and he looked at historical trends in punitive sentiment. And so by punitive sentiment, he means support for the death penalty, harsher judicial sentencing, increasing the authority of law enforcement, and increasing spending on tougher policing. And so what he found was that in the 1960s, punitive sentiment was at an all-time low during this period, and it started to go up in the 1970s and continued to go up and stay at relatively high rates until the late 1990s. So if you're familiar with that often used chart showing the number of prisoners in this country, you would know that the increase coincides with the increase that you see here pretty well. But what we haven't seen is a similar reduction in the number of prisoners that has followed the reduction that we've seen in recent years in punitive sentiment. So this is one way to look at punitive preferences over time, how things have changed. Another way to look at them is to look at variation across segments of the population. So here in this chart, you can see racial differences in support for the death penalty for someone convicted of murder. And this is from a 2013 survey conducted by Pew. So what you see here is that the majority of white Americans supported the death penalty for someone convicted of murder, but only 40% of Hispanics and only 36% of whites supported this, of blacks supported this punishment. In fact, a majority of blacks opposed the death penalty, and about 50% of Hispanics also opposed the death penalty. You see this kind of racial gap in support for punitive policies when it comes to other forms of punishment as well. So here in this chart you can see support for three strikes laws, and you see that far more whites than blacks supported this policy. You see it again with trying juveniles as adults. So this is, repeatedly the case where whites are more punitive than blacks or Hispanics. But I want to just add a few caveats here. And one is that survey wording has a really important role here in determining the outcomes of these surveys. So for example, let me go back here. So this is the survey on the death penalty. When people ask a yes-no, when pollsters ask a yes-no question on the death penalty, then they find that the majority of Americans, just combining everybody, supports the death penalty. But if you ask people whether they support the death penalty or life without the possibility of parole for someone convicted of murder, recently pollsters have found that actually more Americans support life without the possibility of parole. So it's important to not overstate punitiveness, but still, even with more nuanced survey wordings, we still find that there is this racial gap in punitiveness. Another important note to consider is that oftentimes Americans' support for punitive policies is based on misconceptions about how punitive our policies actually are. So sometimes when researchers ask people, how long do you think someone should be sentenced for a particular crime, they find that the average sentences that people recommend are actually below what the guidelines are in state laws. A third important point is that people don't just support punishment, but they also support prevention and rehabilitation. And so in this sense, the American public is pragmatic. So scholars use this term pragmatic to refer to this combined support for not just punishment, but also rehabilitation and prevention. And you can see that here in this chart. So here people are asked, well, how do you think we should reduce crime? Spend more money on education and job training, or more money on prisons and police, or both equally? So you see a substantial portion supports both. Quite large numbers support more spending on education and job training, and so really small proportions support only spending money on punishment. So notwithstanding these important nuances in terms of people's preferences, you can still see that whites are more punitive than African Americans, even in this kind of survey wording. Whites are far more likely to support spending money just on police and prisons, and if they're going to support one policy, they're much less likely than African Americans to support spending on education and job training. And so this is really curious that whites are more punitive than African Americans and Latinos, because white Americans are far less likely to be victims of crime. So this is true across the board with violent and property crimes, but you see the gap especially when you look at the most serious violent crime, and that's homicides. So throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, Black Americans were over six times as likely to be victims of homicide than white Americans. So you might look at this and say, well, maybe whites have an exaggerated sense of their threat. Maybe actually, objectively, they're less at risk, but they think that they're much more at risk. And this is actually not the case either. When you look into emotional and psychological measures about crime, you see that people of color are much more likely to be concerned about crime than white Americans. So in this survey, people were asked, is there an area in your neighborhood where you're afraid to walk alone at night? So that's a really subjective measure, and people of color were more likely to say that they were afraid than white Americans. And so why is this? Why is it that white Americans are more punitive even though they experience less crime than people of color, and even though they're less concerned about crime than people of color? And my answer to this, the main one that I'll be exploring today, is racial perceptions of crime. And so let me give you a roadmap of the talk. So first, I'm going to talk about different measures of racial perceptions of crime. Then I'll talk about how racial perceptions of crime have been shown to be linked to support for punitive policies. Then I'll talk about the various causes of racial perceptions of crime. Then I'll talk about other factors that explain the racial gap in punitiveness. Then I'll talk about the consequences of these biases. And then finally, I'll talk about the recommendations and the tested interventions that I mentioned. So measures of racial perceptions of crime. There are two ways to measure this, and one is to look at it explicitly. So when in these kinds of studies, researchers ask respondents very directly what proportion of crimes, and they list specific crimes like burglaries, illegal drug sales, juvenile crime, what proportion of these crimes do you think were committed by African Americans? And when they collect those figures and they compare them to actual arrest rates as a measure of actual crime rates, they find that white Americans overestimate actual crime committed by African Americans by 20 to 30%. Researchers have also found a similar pattern when they ask whites to estimate the proportion of crime committed by Hispanics. Whites overestimate the actual proportion of crime that's committed by Hispanics. And this is what their researchers will call racial typification of crime. So crime disproportionately, when people think of the typical offender, they'll think of somebody who is Black or Latino rather than white. Another way to measure racial perceptions of crime is to do so implicitly, and this is a set of studies that have been conducted by psychologists primarily who investigate implicit racial bias, and this has been done in a variety of fields, and I'll just talk about the studies that have been done in the criminal justice area, and I describe a number of them in the report. I'll just go in depth on just one type of study here. So with these kinds of studies, researchers create a sort of laboratory setting where they can control for a lot of other factors. And what they do is, for example, they'll show a picture. Let me show you an example. They'll show you a picture of a white face or a black face, and then they'll show you, let's say, in this particular study, an object that's either a weapon or a tool. And you'll be asked quickly to identify whether the object that you saw was a weapon or a tool. And what the researchers are measuring here is your accuracy. So does seeing a black face versus a white face make you more likely to mistake a weapon as a tool as a weapon? And they found that yes, it does. When whites conduct these or participate in these studies, they mistakenly identify objects as weapons when in fact they're just tools when they're shown a black face. They're also more likely to not perceive an object that's a weapon as such, but it's instead to identify it as a tool when they're shown a white face. So that's just one measure. The second measure is the speed with which respondents are able to arrive at their conclusion. And researchers have found that when you show a white face and a tool, respondents can much more quickly identify the tool than when you show them a white face and a weapon. It takes them longer. So that's independent of accuracy. It's just the speed with which decisions are made. And similar studies have been done with criminal justice professionals, especially with police officers. And what researchers have found is that police officers are less likely to make errors in accuracy, but there is still bias in the speed with which they make the call on whether or not what they're seeing is a weapon or a tool or another object. I'm just going back to the previous slide. Something important here is that I focused on the results here from these studies from white participants. When African Americans do these studies, they'll also exhibit some of these biases. And that's because, and they do this at a lower rate than whites, but that's because these biases are prevalent throughout our society. They're unconscious, they're automatic. Even among white Americans who explicitly disavow prejudice, overt prejudice, people like a lot of us on this webinar, we're likely to take these kinds of tests and still fail, either on the accuracy measure or on the speed measure. This is really significant because researchers have shown that these racial perceptions of crime are tied to punitiveness. So let me explain what I mean by that. The higher the percentage, the estimate that people have of how much crime is committed by Black Americans and Hispanics, the higher that white Americans attribute these crimes, the more they attribute these crimes to people of color, the more likely they are to support punitive criminal justice policies. And so this includes policies like the death penalty, increasing sentences, having prisoners work on chain gangs. So the more people associate crime with people of color, the more supportive they are of these policies in general for everybody. And this is true even when researchers statistically control for other factors that predict punitiveness, such as racial prejudice, conservatism, and so on. Researchers have also found that this pattern holds when people are asked about their views on juvenile justice policies. The more respondents think that juvenile crimes are committed by people of color, and the more they think that the victims of these crimes are whites, the more likely they are to support harsh and punitive juvenile justice policies. And so this led Professors Justin Pickett and Ted Chiricos to write that public support for punitive juvenile justice policies to some extent represents a desire to control other people's children. Why does this happen? Why would it be that the more white Americans associate crime with people of color, the more punitive they are? One reason for this is, has been theorized by James Unever and Francis Cullen, and they've tested this as well, is that as there is a growing racial gap between an individual and their perception of the typical offender, that individual is less likely to be able to empathize with the offender. And by that I mean to be able to identify and understand the context in which the crime occurred, to be able to forgive the crime, to be able to understand the suffering associated with whatever punishment is assigned to the person who's committed the crime. And so these researchers have shown, in fact, that people who are less empathetic are more punitive. And so there's the idea that empathy plays an important role here. So given that we know that racial perceptions of crime are significant and have this and lead to these outcomes, and what do we know about what's causing these racial perceptions of crime? And I'm going to start with one factor that might be surprising for some people. One factor that leads to racial perceptions of crime is actual crime trends. So we know that people of color in this country are more likely than whites to live in conditions of concentrated socioeconomic disadvantage in urban areas. these are the kinds of conditions that lead to higher rates of crime. And so for that reason, we know that people, African Americans and Hispanics, commit a higher share of certain violent and property crimes than they represent as a proportion of the general population. They do not commit the majority of these crimes, and as I mentioned earlier, even when researchers look at the actual crime rates, they know that whites even still overestimate and overattribute how much crime blacks and Hispanics commit. But this is a part of this issue that we need to think about when it comes to identifying solutions. I want to add an important caveat here, which is that what I just said is relevant to certain property and violent offenses. It is not relevant for drug offenses. So we know from surveys that people of various racial and ethnic backgrounds use drugs at very similar rates. So for example, this is data from an ACLU study, a terrific study about marijuana arrests relative to usage rates. And what the researchers found was that African American adults were 1.3 times as likely to report having used marijuana in the past month in 2010. So very similar rates, and actually some other measures show that they're less likely or almost equally. And despite that, African American men, I'm sorry, this is men and women, African Americans are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. Right? So this is a broader trend that we see with drug offenses, where we know that people of color and whites use drugs at similar rates. Research also tells us that people generally purchase drugs from people of the same race and ethnicity as them, and yet that's not what we see in our arrest patterns, and that's not what we see in our criminal justice system, and it's also not what we see in polls when Americans are asked what their conception is of who is committing drug offenses. So moving on to the next major contributor to racial perceptions of crime, the media. So there's a whole wide range of media coverage on crime, but what we know is from a lot of studies, even of major outlets, is that we still see bias in both the quantity of coverage, so the amount of attention, disproportionate attention given to crime committed by African Americans, and in particular, crime committed against whites by African Americans, which is extremely anomalous. So that's one kind of disparity. Another kind of disparity is a qualitative difference, and I'll get to that in a second. So first let me talk about this study of the Columbus, Ohio newspaper, where the researcher asked what made for newsworthiness? How did reporters decide which crime stories, which homicide stories to cover? So he asked, did the reporters gravitate towards the most representative, which would have been murders committed by African American men against African American men? And he found that they did not. He asked, did they look for the most novel or unusual types of crimes? And that would be murders committed by white women against white men. And he found that they didn't do that either. So they weren't going for the most common or the least common. Instead, they were going for this odd combination of crimes committed by African American men among white women. And so this led this researcher to write that newsworthiness and seemed to be scripted using stereotypes grounded in white racism and white fear of black crime. So what's really important here is not just that this kind of coverage will exaggerate sense of fear and risk among whites potentially, but it'll also lead to them underestimating how much African Americans are victims of crimes rather than whites. And so I mentioned the second way that we see disparity in media coverage is a qualitative disparity. And what I mean here is differences in how, not just how much, but how blacks and Latinos are presented compared to whites. And so studies of TV news coverage have found that blacks and Latinos are more likely to be left unnamed in crime stories, so presented in an unindividualized way. They're also more likely to be shown in a threatening manner, for example, in physical custody of police. So the next major contributor to racial perceptions of crime is our policymakers and the messaging that they provide and the policies that they have implemented in the criminal justice area. So on the left I have a picture of Willie Horton. So this is one of the most infamous examples of policymakers contributing to racialized perception of crime. So this was during George H.W. Bush's presidential campaign, and Willie Horton was raised as an example of his contender Michael Dukakis's lax criminal justice policies. Willie Horton was released from prison on a furlough program. He then raped a white woman and assaulted her fiancé. Now, the Bush campaign never explicitly referenced Horton's race, but because of their repeated allusions to his crime, it led the media to repeatedly broadcast his image, and the audience would then be able to identify him as an African American, and because his victim was a public figure who became a public figure as a result of this, knew that this was a black crime against a white person. So this is an example of, again, the recurring theme of emphasizing black crime against white Americans when it's really an anomalous combination. Another way that policymakers contribute to exaggerated perceptions, racialized associations of crime, is through their policies. And I'll just talk about the first one listed here, drug-free school zones. So this is an example of an ostensibly race-neutral policy that disproportionately affects people of color. So what these laws do is that they increase prison sentences for people that are caught selling drugs in school zones. Now that sounds like a great idea. However, in urban areas, studies have shown that some urban areas, there's hardly any area that is not a school zone. And so if someone is outside selling drugs, if they were in a suburb, they wouldn't have been in a school zone. They're more likely to be white and not get this penalty enhancement. But if they're an urban resident and therefore more likely to be a person of color, they will get this penalty enhancement. Criminal justice professionals also contribute to racial perceptions of crime by skewing the criminal justice system so that there's a disproportionate number of people of color incarcerated relative to the amount of crime that people of color are committing. And so this happens in two ways, both through individual discretion and through office policy, organizational policy, and I'll talk a little bit about this. So it starts with police officers. So we know from research on traffic stops that the police are more likely to stop people of color, in particular African Americans, for reasons that rely more on their discretion rather than because of a rule violation. So for example, a lower proportion of African Americans are stopped for speeding tickets than for whites. Instead, a higher proportion of African Americans than whites are pulled over because in order for the police to do a record check or for no stated reason at all. So the next step in the criminal justice system is an encounter with the prosecutor's office. And we know that there are policies in place guiding plea deal arrangements, but also individual discretion of prosecutors that lead them most often inadvertently to give worse plea offers to people of color than to whites, even when we control for the severity of the offense, the criminal background of the individual, and so on. Next, we have judges. So when judges are authorized to make bail decisions, research has shown that they demand a higher money bond from people of color than whites. When it comes to sentencing, they are more likely to sentence people of color than whites to prison and to send them there to serve longer terms. And again, this is even when you control for the severity of the offense, the criminal history of the individual, and class, for example, as measured by educational level. So the outcome of these policies and practices is that we have a criminal justice system where nearly 60% of people in prison are black and Hispanic, even though this population accounts for only 30% of the total population. And so if people were to look at the criminal justice system to get their cues for how much crime is committed by these populations, they would reach vastly exaggerated conclusions. So I'm just going to briefly now talk about other factors that explain the racial gap in punitiveness. Racial perceptions of crime are not everything. Other factors are relevant as well, and let me just talk a bit about these. I mentioned them, I talk about them in greater depth in the report. So first, there is the fact that white Americans are much less likely than people of color to have any kind of encounter with the police or with the justice system. And when they have these encounters, they're much more likely to conclude that they were fair and they were treated with fairness and without bias. So, for example, just on the measure of encounter with the justice system, Larry Bobo and colleagues did a study where they asked people, do they know someone who was currently incarcerated? They found that half of African Americans reported having a close friend or relative that was currently incarcerated at the time of the study, half. In contrast to that, only 1 in 10 white respondents in that study said that they knew somebody at that time that was incarcerated. So that's a big difference. So the next factor is racial prejudice. We know now that we are in a country where overt racial prejudice is not something that the majority of people express, luckily. So, it's a minority of the population that will say things like they think schools should be segregated, the neighborhoods should be segregated, and so on. But there are still substantial portions of the population that subscribe to these views, especially among the white population. And researchers have shown that racial prejudice of this type is one of the strongest predictors of support for punitive policies. And then the third factor is the kinds of explanations people come up with for why individuals engage in crime. So we know that the decision to commit crime is a combination of environmental context and an individual's choices, right? But what we see from studies is that white Americans overwhelmingly attribute crime to individual shortcomings and moral failure. And people of color are more likely to emphasize the opposite end of that spectrum and to attribute crime to structural causes. And so this helps to explain why whites are more likely to conclude that punishment is a solution for crime than people of color, who are more likely to want to get at the root causes behind crime. The consequences of these kinds of perceptions. So I'm just going to summarize this pretty quickly. One of the consequences of these racial perceptions of crime is that we have a criminal justice system that's on overdrive, that's far more punitive than peer countries. So for example, the United States has an incarceration rate that's 5 times as high as England's, 6 times as high as our neighbors to the north, Canada, and 3 times as high as our neighbors to the south, as Mexico. And it's not differences in levels of crime that explain why we have such a higher rate of incarceration, but instead it's differences in our reaction to crime and our crime policies. Another consequence of these racial perceptions of crime is that these policies disproportionately affect people of color, and that's because they're more likely to be the target of police enforcement, they're more likely to be affected by bias among criminal justice professionals, they're more likely to be targeted by the policies that I was describing earlier. Another outcome is that people of color, especially young people of color, are at risk of deadly violence from police and civilians whose perception of risk and threat is colored by the race of the individual that they're confronting. And then final outcome is that the criminal justice system has a blemished appearance for a lot of people. And so here you can see on this chart difference between blacks and whites in terms of whether they think that the criminal justice system is biased against black people. So pretty consistently for quite some time, the majority of African Americans have said yes, while only a minority of whites have described the justice system as biased against black people. So this is really significant that such a high proportion of blacks thinks that the justice system is biased against them, because it gets in the way of policing. It makes it harder for police to have cooperation in neighborhoods where they're trying to do their work because many in communities don't see them as, in black and brown communities, won't recognize the police as legitimate. It also affects the work of prosecutors. Prosecutors have a harder time getting guilty verdicts because people don't trust police for testifying against somebody and so on. But it also affects whites. So the fact that white Americans, so for example, there's a study recently that's shown that in a sort of laboratory environment where students were taking a test, and what the researchers did was that they targeted African American students in one of these test settings for extra scrutiny. And accused African American students of cheating when there was no reason for them to confront these students. What they found when they created these environments was that white students were much more likely to cheat in these conditions than when they were just in a test environment where black students weren't being targeted for extra scrutiny. So this would suggest that potentially feeling like they can get past the radar would lead to higher crime rates among whites. So finally, my recommendations. I'll start with the media. So there's a great report that I've linked here by Lori Dorfman and Vincent Schiraldi, and which outlines a lot of these recommendations. So it's important for the media to compare the racial composition of offenders and victims in crime news with regional crime rates to see what kind of disparity exists and how to correct and begin to correct for it. Next, it's important to do content analysis to assess disparities not just in how much crime stories differ by race, but also in how they differ by race. And that has to do with what I was describing earlier, showing people of color without identifying their names, being more likely to show them in police custody and so on. And then finally, it's important for the media to assess representativeness of sentencing stories and crime stories. So we all know about these stories where somebody has committed manslaughter in a car and gets away with no prison sentence at all, or we hear about celebrity stories of overdoses and so on. It's important to contextualize these stories to give a sense of, well, what is the actual average sentence that people are experiencing for these crimes? Is this incident part of a crime wave, or is it something anomalous that's happening? So these are some suggestions. Recommendations for pollsters and researchers would be to make sure to use the best survey methods and to accurately report and emphasize the results so that the public doesn't appear more punitive than it actually is. So now policymakers. I have 2 pages for policymakers because criminal justice policies have played such an important part in the problem that we're finding ourselves in now, and they need to play a really big role in getting us out of this situation. So first, it's important for policymakers to understand that the public is pragmatic. So they don't just support punishment, they support prevention and rehabilitation. Next, it's important to lead and educate the public about the harms of excessive punishment. And so there are a number of countries, but also regions within our country that we can look at for models of this. So for example, in Canada, the public there is almost as punitive as the American public, but criminal justice policies there are not nearly as harsh as those that we have here. In England and France, so now I know I'm talking about France, I may as well be saying Jupiter for some audiences, but bear with me, I'm going to get back to the US soon. So in England and France, the policymakers abolished the death penalty at a time when the majority of the populations in these countries supported executions. But over time, the public has become less punitive after these reforms, and now a minority of residents in England and France support capital punishment. And then, luckily, we have great models from around this country, and I'm going to talk about these next. So when we want to look for what states have begun to take the necessary steps to dramatically scale back punishment and get us back to something more reasonable rate, we see that New York, New Jersey, and California really stand out. In the past 10 years, they've reduced their prison populations by about 25%. At the same time, their crime rates have fallen almost in all categories faster than the reduction around the country, and there's been no backlash no backlash against the reforms that have taken place there. The juvenile justice system has a lot to teach the adult justice system. There, youth confinement and detention has decreased by 40% since 2001. So that's about scaling back mass incarceration. So now to target and eliminate racial disparities in the justice system. We have a number of great models here. So all of these laws that I've described earlier as ones that we recognize now that have a disparate racial impact, a number of states around the country are beginning to recognize that and repeal them. So very recently, California eliminated the crack cocaine sentencing disparity that that state had. Drug-free school zone laws, you can click the link there later when you have access to the PDF, and read a report about jurisdictions and states around the country that are beginning to eliminate that disparity because of the unwarranted racial disparity that it creates. Another approach are racial impact analyses, and so this is a kind of analysis that some states are beginning to undertake, Iowa, Connecticut, Oregon, and Minnesota, and it's similar to financial impact analysis or environmental impact analysis where new bills are carefully scrutinized for the kind of racial impact they would have, so that policymakers don't just implement policies and then get surprised a few years later when they realize that they're, that they're disproportionately impacting blacks and Hispanics. So scaling back the justice system that we have right now is not enough. It's not sufficient. We also need to look back and correct some of the damages that we've created. And so Susan Tucker and Eric Cadora, I've linked their paper on justice reinvestment, articulate this really well. The savings that states begin to realize from scaling back mass incarceration should be reinvested into communities that were harmed by these policies. So where we used to spend money on locking people up, we should now be reinvesting more productively into these communities. Next, millions of people are haunted by criminal records, so just releasing people from prison is not enough. We have to figure out how people are going to get back on their feet, and a number of states and localities around the country have been working towards this. So ban the box ordinances and legislation, remove the question about conviction history from job application. They delay it until later in the process so that people with records can be on some kind of equal footing when applying for jobs. States in many ways can easily, for example, when it comes up to the welfare and food stamp ban, so they've opted into banning people from access to these federal benefits. If legislatures would agree, they could easily opt out of it as well and let people who are coming out of prison with felony drug convictions access these benefits and help them to get back on their feet. Felony disenfranchisement is another area of needed reforms, and we've also been seeing necessary changes beginning to take place around the country so that people, when they come out of prison and have finished their sentences, have their right to vote and have not lost it, or don't have to take cumbersome steps in order to have that right reinstated. This is my last slide, and these are some suggestions for, recommendations based on reforms that have been put into place by criminal justice professionals. Last week I was at the Brennan Center and I heard Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance describe the work that his office had done. And he said that none of us feel that we're biased, but the statistics show that there's a bias that needs to be examined. And so this is what he's referencing was a project that DA's office engaged in with the Vera Institute of Justice, where they carefully examined plea negotiations and plea deal outcomes to see whether there was unwarranted racial disparities, and they found that there was. And that's because of an office policy to offer worse plea deals to people who had arrest histories. Now we know that as a result of police practices in New York, stop and frisk practices in particular, people of color are much more likely to have arrest histories, and as a result they were getting worse plea deals, and so the office is being encouraged to change that policy. The Brooklyn DA's office has also implemented reforms. Kenneth Thompson, the DA there, recently announced that his office is going to stop prosecuting many minor marijuana arrests to reduce the overcriminalization of young people of color. Another important area of reform has been to revise risk assessment instruments, and this is something that actually Attorney General Holder recently commented on, and it's an area that the Annie E. Casey Foundation has done great work on, in particular focusing on juvenile justice. For example, in Multnomah County in Oregon, they've revised a risk assessment instrument to remove some of the unwarranted racial bias that was being produced. And so finally, there's the issue of implicit racial bias. An important first step here is to dispel people's illusions that they're colorblind in their decision making. And so to that end, one step that many people can take is to take the implicit association test. And as I mentioned earlier, even many of us, if we take this test, will find that we're not doing very well. And so that's really critical to realize that these biases are widespread in order to begin to both either counter them or to at least mitigate the impact that they can have on decision making. And so, for example, U.S. District Judge Mark Bennett has been doing some of this work with his jurors. So he has them watch a video that demonstrates the impact of implicit biases. He has them read about this and sign a pledge to try to monitor its impact on their work. The National Center for State Courts has been doing work in a couple of jurisdictions around the country, and their website has some important, useful resources to offer. And so in addition to recognize these biases, it's important to counter them, and increasing racial diversity in criminal justice settings is an important factor here. So that includes making juries more diverse, making police forces more diverse, and also making our political leadership more diverse. And we've seen many calls for this coming from Ferguson. And so what I've tried to show here is that this is an important but it can't be the exclusive step that we take in order to counter racial perceptions of crime. So what we know is that both the good news and the bad news is that even people who are not overtly racist and biased harbor these kinds of these associations and biases. And so the good news is by just raising awareness, then we can encourage people and work to develop a criminal justice system that's more aligned with our principles. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nazgol. We'll now start the Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, you can either do that by typing it in over the GoToWebinar interface, and we will get your questions that way. Or if you'd like to ask your question through your mic or over the telephone if you called in, you can do that as well. Although you have to make sure that you're not muted on your end and also that you have dialed into the audio. If you'd like to ask a question that way, raise your hand. There's a little hand icon that allows you to raise your hand, and we'll see you that way. Otherwise, one note, if you are typing in your question and your question is about a specific slide, please reference either the title of that slide or the number in your question. We have a few questions already that have come in. So the first one is, as with the policing, prosecution, and sentencing stages of the criminal justice system, are people of color disproportionately likely to have their parole or probation denied or revoked?
Yes, actually, that is a good question, and the answer is that yes, they are. And I think that it was the Urban Institute that recently put out a report on this topic. If this individual wants to contact me by email later, I'd be happy to share with them research on this. But these are disparities that we see. I mean, there's just, I don't know of any stage where that research hasn't found unwarranted racial disparities.
Great. Another question is referencing slide number 18, which is causes of racial perceptions of crime, media representation. And the question is, could you give us the source of the Ohio newspaper study?
Okay, sure, I'd be happy to do that. Let me see if I can find it for you quickly.
And if not,
maybe I'll come back. Maybe I'll take the next question, and then I'll just look this up while we talk, and then I can mention the source once I find it.
Okay, sounds great. The next question is referencing slide number 24.
Oh, okay. Jean, sorry to interrupt you. I found it. So it's by, the author is Lundeman. It's footnote 115 in the report, in case you should be able to access the report, and the full source is there. It's a piece by Lundeman, and the title is Newsworthiness and Selection Bias in News About Murder.
Great. And again, if anyone wants to find that, it's also in the report itself, which you can download from our website. So the next question references slide number 24, and this person asks, isn't it significant that 25% of whites thought that the justice system was biased against black people? This seems positive, so could this reflect white support for reform?
I think that it's definitely positive to see that proportion among that population that answered yes there. I recently saw a poll after Ferguson that suggested that the results on this kind of a survey have changed a bit since Ferguson, and in particular for young people. And so this is something that we need to look at more as far as what's going on in this particular chart here. I mean, 25% or even the 33% where it had been, that's an awfully low proportion, especially because this is not just a matter of opinion or this is not just a hunch. I mean, this is really well established that black Americans are not getting fair treatment in the justice system. And so it's disappointing for me that only a slim minority of whites are agreeing to, that they recognize that fact.
Great. Another question that's come in is, what policy recommendations do you have to decrease the disproportionality of punishment in the school system?
Okay, this is a great question. As far as the school system, I think an important step is to recognize, I mean, I'll just focus on this recommendation, which is that to think more critically about our use of school safety officers and the role that they have. And so the disproportionate presence of these officers in schools with black and brown students means that these students are much more likely to have interactions with these officers. And to the extent that we've set up this relationship so that the same kind of misbehavior in other schools would just, maybe get a detention or maybe get a suspension, but in schools with primarily students of color are much more likely to lead to arrests, in addition to the fact that we know the implicit biases that I've described here lead to teachers being more likely to suspend and just to have to rely on harsher sanctions against students of color. So I would start with reconsidering the use of school resource officers and the particular role that they should have, and how often troublesome behavior in schools should be referred to police rather than handled internally within the school system.
Great. Another question. Isn't it problematic, even with violent and property crimes, to use arrest rates as a proxy for the crime rate? Can't we assume there are racial inequities in enforcement even beyond drug crimes?
Yeah, this is a terrific question. So let me go back to this slide that is probably troubling this person. So, I think this is one of the this part of the report is when I spent a lot of time thinking about and, kind of double checking to see what is the right way to, what is the truth here and what are the causes of these outcomes here. So, the way that, luckily there's a lot of research that's been done on this, and what it's shown is that we know based on, when we look at some other measure of crime beyond arrest rates, we know that drug arrests have very little relationship with what's actually happening in terms of drug crime. But we also know one way to check arrest rates for violent and property crimes is to compare this data with victimization surveys. And when researchers have done that, they found that especially for the more serious violent and property offenses, there's a pretty good overlap between the race of the person who's arrested and the race of the person who's reported as the offender from victimization surveys. There's, the match is less good once you get to the less serious offenses. So for, simple assault, for example. But when you think about, I think of robbery as an example. If you think about the disproportionate amount of robbery that's committed by African Americans than whites, do you sense that if you just think about if you know anybody who's been robbed, that's never really a conclusive measure, but white Americans are not disproportionately committing robberies, and they're probably committing the majority of them because they are the largest bulk of the population. But the problem here has to do with the life conditions that lead to people of color to commit these crimes more. I don't think that the problem here, especially with the more serious violent offenses, have to do with the data themselves.
Great. Okay, another question. Do you know if there are any data on whether there's a reduced disparity when it comes to police departments that have more officers who are Black or Latino or female?
Can you repeat that?
Do you know if there are any data showing maybe reduced racial disparities coming from police departments when those police departments have officers who are Black, Latino, or female?
That's a great question, and I don't know. There might be research that shows that link, but I'm not sure. But I can put in a plug here for the forthcoming book from James Foreman Jr., who's a Yale law professor, who's looking at racial disparities in the justice system within Washington, D.C., where there's a large Black and brown population among the police force and also among the electorate. And so what he looks at is to try to explain why is it that we still have this, criminal justice system in D.C. that in some ways is worse than what's going on around the country, or at least historically had been, even when we have so many in particular so much Black leadership and Black representation in the police force. And the conclusion I think that he's going to be exploring, and I'm not going to do justice to it here, is that there are much broader forces at play here. And so just independently tackling the issue of diversity alone within this broader structure is not going to solve the problem. It's an important part of it, and we can see that many problems can be prevented in many jurisdictions with greater diversity, but by itself is not sufficient.
Okay, great. With that, it looks like we're out of time. Unfortunately, we were not able to get to everyone's questions, but we will send out the webinar slides as well as a recording of the webinar via email. And on the slides, there's Nazgol's contact information, including her email address and her Twitter handle. So you can find her on Twitter, or you can email. Please do send your questions in if we didn't get to them. So thank you so much, Nazgol, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone who participated and attended.